Thanks. So before we get started, I just posted it in the Slack channel, the slides, or if you want to grab the URL before I put it in full screen. It'll be useful for when we jump into Plunker. I have a before for each one of these guys, or for each one of my demos. So you'll be able to just fork off of that if you have a Plunker account and follow along. This is what Plunker is. It's just like a playground kind of thing for JavaScript, HTML, CSS. That way you don't have to go through the whole process of setting up your local environment. You can just jump into here and start angularing away. So let me know when you got the slides, and then I'll get started here. I'll go ahead and get started then. Yeah. Columbus Web Group. Okay, cool. So as Kevin said, I'm Brady Stephenson. I'm a consultant here at Columbus Web Group, I mean Cardinal Solutions Group. I'm an overall web developer. I've done a few things apart from Angular. Worked with IoT for a little bit, which is really fun. And then some other odds and ends kind of things. I've worked with AngularJS on a few projects now over the last few years. And Kevin mentioned the mentoring program. That was actually in Cardinal Solutions Group before it came to Columbus Web Group. And him and a few others I mentored in AngularJS as well. So what we'll be talking about today is what is Angular. We're going to go through like the setup, even though it's really simple to set up in Plunker. I just want to make sure everyone gets started on the right foot. Then we'll talk about controllers, some built-in Angular components, which are different kind of directives, services, and filters that we'll go over. Then we'll start creating our own custom directives, and then we'll talk about the scoping between those directives. And then we'll talk about how to get things from a remote server and create custom services. And if we can get to it, we'll talk about how to increase the performance of Angular. So first, what is AngularJS? It's a structural framework for dynamic web applications. It decouples the DOM from JavaScript, so you can write your HTML and JavaScript separate and communicate between the two with two-way binding. It's an MV star type architecture. That's what Angular has it on their website, but I think most people use it as like a mono-view controller kind of architecture. And it's really nice to be able to do dependency injection with Angular. So you can bring in things, the only things you need for the actual directives and custom things that you make. And then, like I said, the two-way binding makes it a good way to communicate between your DOM structure and your JavaScript seamlessly. And it's also highly testable. As Alex said, he is on a project with me doing testing. And Angular makes it really easy to be able to test everything that you do. So setup for Angular is pretty simple. Like other JavaScript frameworks, you just have to pretty much import the script inside of your head or whatever tag in the script tag. Here's a really simple example. You can just import your Angular app there, and then inside of the JavaScript, you just, actually you use ng-app to actually tell Angular what to load, what module to look for, and then you create the module in your JavaScript like so. We'll get started. here, and then this is kind of what the default plunker looks like when you jump into here. And then we're just going to press launch the editor, and that'll give us a brand new plunker to work with. And what's really nice about this is we can go in here. AngularJS is the first thing on the list. Yeah. You're good?
You don't have to follow along. It's probably better to be watching.
Okay. So here we can just import the AngularJS library, and it'll just put it into our HTML. Pretty simple. And then you can just jump into the script.js and then define your module. And you can see a preview, and as you start typing in here, things will change. So if I jump into the index file again, I can change this to it should just update accordingly. So now that we're set up, we can start talking about some components that Angular offers. Here we can create our own custom controller, and that's where usually you have your business logic. You can also think of it as like a constructor function if you're familiar with other kind of languages. That's simply what a controller is, and we'll just you just define it by saying ng controller. This is if you're using just a controller. And then the two-way binding I talked about, you just use what's called mustache syntax to communicate between your JavaScript and your HTML. And it's really simple to do. We'll see a good example of that. So here inside of your JavaScript, you define your controller by telling it what module you're going to be using, and then you just do .controller, and then you give it a name, and then you can do an inline function or write a separate function and just reference that, and then you define your scope, which we'll get into what scope actually is later, but right now you can think of it as a way to communicate between your HTML and your JavaScript. And that's what this here is referencing, just the variable things that I created inside of the JavaScript. Does that make sense? So last time I forgot to actually define the app, so I'm going to do that now. Yeah. Is that good? Okay, so now that I actually defined the module that I clearly had in the slides earlier, you just define it as the same module here, and the square brackets here are just saying we don't depend on any other application. Sometimes you'll have stuff in there, say for some reason you want to use UI Bootstrap or other libraries out there that are Angular specific. You can import them here. But since we're not doing that, that's why it's an empty array. So now I've defined our actual controller. There is actually a shorthand here for actually defining your modules. The reason why I'm doing it the long way is because that's just kind of best practices that I've learned through like a style guide kind of thing that I follow. It just makes it so because when you separate these into different files, it makes it so you can easily tell what module you're working in every time you define something. Because usually you define one component per file, and since I'm wanting to simplify it here, I'm just going to throw everything into just the one file, and we'll work from that. But normally you would separate these out into different files. Just for simplicity's sake, I'm just keeping them all in one. What do you mean size limit?
CFCs.
No, I don't think so.
It craps out.
Nope, you should be fine. I don't suggest writing a full component in 14,000 lines of code, but yeah.
Well, with different functions inside the component.
Yeah, it should be fine. I don't think there's any kind of limit. At least that I've run into, I haven't. So, actually did that wrong. So, the shorthand, you can say app.controller instead of the way that I did it in the slides where I was saying which module it was and then doing .controller. But here I can do the shorthand to make it a little more simple. And then you just give the controller a name. Then I'm going to actually define my function separate. It's also a best practices thing that I've seen is instead of doing an inline function, you can do it this way so it actually shows up in the debugger later on. If you have any kind of problems and some kind of error, it'll actually tell you which component it's coming from if you define it this way, because it does it by the function name. Here I'm just defining a couple variables that we can see the two-way binding between the HTML and the JavaScript. And since I'm using an API later, I'm keeping it League of Legends, kind of League of Legends game related, just because it'll be kind of fun and interesting. Inside here, I'm going to change the title of this, and you don't say scope here. You just tell Angular to use the title. And actually, because I didn't put the controller here, so it's not going to work. So I'm going to define my controller. And now it should magically work. Now we should see both variables there. So if I go back into the script tag, let's see kind of what's going on here. I'm using, like I said before, we're going to define actually what scope is later. But this is kind of the thing I was talking about earlier of what Angular does is this $ scope here that we're telling Angular or telling the controller that we need is kind of the way we do dependency injection. So if we have some kind of service, Angular service that we want to use in our application, we have to first tell Angular to inject it into our controller or our other components. And we'll see some more examples of that later. But this is just the simple one that you first start out with is learning what scope is and injecting scope in here. And most of the time, you will be injecting at least scope until you get into some other best practices that some people follow. Is there any questions on controllers at all? Before I jump into the next thing?
Have you heard anything about
Using a controller for scoping?
Yeah. And then in the HTML, what you do is
Yeah. I wasn't going to get into that, but yes, for best practices, a lot of people use that kind of syntax, and especially with ES 2015 coming out, a lot of people are also using the actual keyword this, which is kind of what scope is. But yeah, what he's talking about is in the beginning of your file, you define VM, and then you just make it equal to this. And then instead of using scope, you use VM. Actually, we'll get it. I haven't actually tried that on just the controller, but I'll demonstrate that when we get to the directive part of this.
I was just curious if you found anything on best practice, whether one's better than the other for whatever reason.
Yeah, the reason why people do that is just it's more readable,
Right.
both on the HTML and in the JavaScript side. I'm actually doing that on a very large project now, and it makes it much more easier to read. And I think Angular even mentions that in the HTML when you reference a variable, a scope variable, usually they want some kind of dot syntax.
Right.
So like in here, if you use the VM keyword, you would do VM.title. And all VM is just a variable name. And the reason why they call it VM is because of view model kind of thing. It just makes it a little more readable than just using scope everywhere. Thanks, that was a good question. So what kind of built-in components we have in Angular? So the different kinds we have is a directive. And this is just a reusable component that you can use across your site. So if you define it like right now, or we're just going to make it simple and use it in the index.html, but you can use it across the site and keep on reusing them. It's also a custom DOM element, like a div or similar to what a div or a span and those kind of tags look like. You can make your own custom ones, and Angular has their own custom ones as well. Usually they're an element or an attribute, element being the tag itself or something you're sending in. Like if you use an image tag, you would use the source is what you're sending into that custom directive. So like I said, most are either element or an attribute. Angular has many built-in directives that make it very useful to communicate and just do anything possible pretty much. And you can you have the ability to create your own custom Angular directives, and that's where it's very useful, and we'll get into that later in the slides. And then most built-in directives are prefixed with ng. The reason being is because maybe someday Angular, not Angular, but there's a new tag that introduced that would overwrite our tag. So we don't want to, we usually prefix it in some way, and Angular does the same thing. So for example, if you would create a new tag, something like, we'll do one later, but like champions, which I don't think will ever actually get overwritten, but if someday HTML says, oh, we want League of Legends in all of everyone's HTML, so we're going to make this champions element tag. So that's why we always prefix with something. Usually it's 2 to 3 letters, something simple. So also, what is a service? These are kind of the dependency injection we did in the controller. So $scope is an actual Angular built-in service, and you use that kind of right off the bat. But it's just an object wired together through dependency injection. It's used to share code across your application. So if you use scope in one controller, you can use it in other controllers as well. Usually you don't actually share the reference there, but for scope, but you'll use it other places as well. So it's lazily instantiated, so you only load the components that you actually need inside of your directive or your controllers. It's a singleton, so each component gets a reference to the service. I think $scope is kind of a special case, but other ones, you'll see that, like if we make our own custom service, you'll see that if we reference that, we can get the same kind of information across our application. Okay, so filters is just a way to, just like it says, is filter DOM inside of our, or filter arrays inside of our DOM. It's also can be used for changing format of text. Maybe you want, instead of using CSS, you can use a filter to uppercase everything or lowercase everything. And then we'll just jump right into code. So inside of my script tag here, I'm just going to define some kind of array. So since we're doing League of Legends themed, I'm going to define us some champions here. I'm just going to copy and paste instead. So I defined an array of objects. That way we can see more than just like an array of strings or something like that. We can see more information available. And this is kind of the way Angular, or this is kind of the way you expect being able to bring in data anyways. So you have an array of objects in JSON kind of format. And then inside of our HTML, we can reference that now. So I'm just going to create a new div. And then inside of here, I'm going to use an Angular directive called ng-repeat. Here we're going to define a new variable called champion. And then we're going to say for every, and we're going to use every champions, which is inside of here. That's the variable we're referencing, and then we're just creating a new variable for each time around, similar to like a for loop or any other kind of looping in your programming languages you use. Then inside of here, we can reference each of these properties that we made. So I'm just going to show each property to make it simple. So here you can see we're referencing each individual objects, and you can actually, this doesn't matter since, or you can name this whatever you want since you're creating it inside of your, inside of the ng repeat. So I can rename this to champ, and make it a little more clear, and then everything now works the same.
Why is that? Because the reference is
Yep. And then, well, I changed the variables here as well. I just wanted to demonstrate that you can name this whatever you want inside of your HTML, and it'll create that reference for each time around. So another directive we can use is ng model, which is a good way to communicate between user input. So I'm going to create just a text box field, and then we'll be able to have the user input some kind of value, and it will be recorded inside ng model. Then I'm also going to define a button, and we're going to use another directive called ngClick. And then here I'm just going to reference a function that I haven't created yet. So I'm going to just add that, and then I'm going to tell it the value I want to send in. And then actually give the button something to say. Then inside of my script, I'm just going to define a new function. And since since I need to expose this to the HTML, because I'm referencing it here, it needs to also be a scope object. So when I define this, if I would just say function add and then new value, and then just console log, or yeah, I'll just do a console log, and we'll see that that's probably not big enough, is it? So now if I click on this button, if I would expect to be able to see that log since I'm creating a new function. But since it's not an actual scope variable, it's kind of like a private function to the JavaScript. So now if I change this and say, okay, now I want a scope.add, then I have to actually make it equal to a function. Now when I click this button, I expect to actually be able to see the console log that I created. And that's not really helping us too much, so I'm going to actually have this add do something. So I'm going to create a new variable because I'm going to add the whole object or the whole array or the whole object with the same structure that I have here. And I'm just going to use the name as whatever the user is adding. So I want to create some kind of ID there just because since we have that structure already. And since we're bringing in just the name, I want to create the new structure and then just reference the new ID and then the name as the name that's coming in. And then since we're using an array here for the champions, I'm just going to push that new object inside of the array. Does that make sense to everyone? Cool. So if I demonstrate this, I can put in a new name. And I expect it to actually add on the DOM right away because I'm just adding that to that array. And Angular is smart enough to know, oh, something's been added to here, so I can just add that to the DOM structure as well. And since this is using ng model for this input, I can actually I could reference that input value with scope instead, and make sure that I named it the same. I did not, so. Which is actually good because then I can demonstrate that it's a different value. So now if I try to add the same one, it should update just as fine or just as good. You notice that I'm not passing in the rank. So instead of keeping this empty here with no value, I can introduce another Angular directive called ngIf, which just tells Angular to hide or show the span or whatever tag that you put this on. So yeah, it doesn't create the DOM structure. If you use ng show or hide, that actually uses display none, which is a CSS property, and it's more performant if you actually use ngIf instead. That's why I didn't demonstrate the ng show or hide. Yep. Yep, exactly. So this will just be so. What I'm doing here is just a if statement pretty much. So if the champion has this property called myRank, then create this DOM structure. And now if I add something, it won't show that div at all, or the span at all now, because of this if statement. So if
So would you then need a scope inside your structure where certain or
can you repeat the question again?
would you have to scope inside your structure?
Inside of the JavaScript?
Yeah, that if no rank is passed to insert a null, because don't you want a value represented there regardless?
That just depends on the use case.
Okay.
So if you want to show like, maybe you want to show something different, we could, both inside of the JavaScript or inside of the span, or inside of the HTML, we could define some kind of value or another thing to show. So I could go in here and say, this would probably be a better example. Let me separate this out a little bit. Make it a little more readable. So what I'll do instead is I'll put the ngIf on here. And then I can do the opposite here and say ngIf. Well, it'll still be an ngIf, but I can say if there's not a champion dot my rank, and then I can just tell the user that no ranking available. So now it'll show that instead. But you could also do that if you want to do it in the JavaScript when the data comes in. You can do that too. So inside of here, let me get rid of this console so it's easier to see. Inside of here, we could define this as and then you wouldn't actually have to have this thing at all. But that kind of thing just depends on the use case. So if you need to show some kind of value, you can still do it in some way. You can either do it on the JavaScript side or the HTML side. It just depends on how you want to do it and what data you have coming in. Yep, pretty much.
Hey, Brady, question. Is it just conditionals that are in the ngIf?
Yes, or a reference to a function. So let me undo
Okay.
my changes here.
So you
Yep.
can put a function in there.
Yes. Okay. So this is also, will kind of cover that use case too, is I can reference a function here instead that will do my conditional. This is really useful if you have a very large conditional that you have and you want to separate it from the DOM, which is usually a good idea if you get some kind of large structure or some large kind of if statement. The element that you have?
Yeah, back to HTML, you're saying show ranking function. Which element of the array?
Well, Angular is smart enough to be able to reference the right thing. So if I go in here, let me. Yes, actually, I did forget that we can pass in the.
I didn't know if I was
Yeah.
missing something. I wasn't,
Yep.
wasn't picking on you.
I was missing something. You weren't missing something. I did. Okay,
Well-
so now we can do the same kind of thing. So this is, I have to return it though, but we're at? Oh yeah, thanks. Live coding, it's always fun. So now, if I add something, it should do the same thing, except for I forgot to remove this thing. Now I'll stop lying to you, and it should work. Okay, there we go. So the same kind of result. It's really useful if you have some additional logic you want to put into your ngIf. You can just reference that that function, and then just write your logic inside of a function instead of inside of the DOM. Okay, so what I want to do next is talk about another directive, or actually talk about the different kinds of filters we have available. So here I'm gonna create a new input field again. And we're going to use ngModel again, and this time I'm going to call the new variable search, if I can spell it. Then I'm going to add another button. Actually, need that. Then inside of here, I'm going to use a filter, and the type just means that I'm going to be using some kind of filter. You can actually get into use cases where you need your own custom filters, but here I'm just going to use an Angular out-of-the-box filter and tell it to use the search variable. Now if I go in here, it should magically start filtering the variables inside of my champions array here. I'll actually do both the whatever values you have inside of this object. So if I start typing one of the names, it'll filter. If I start typing one of the ID or ranking, it'll also filter that as well. And even though I'm demonstrating the power of, or the magic of Angular here with the filter, this is something going to the performance thing that I think we had a question inside of our surveys about increasing performance for Angular. This is actually something you should avoid using, just because it creates a lot of overhead and watchers to figure out and search all these fields here. Since we're using this filter and we're searching this full array of things here, right now it seems fine, but this isn't very scalable. If you have a lot of things inside of here, it's not a good idea to start using filters like this. Actually, in Angular 2, they removed the filters here because they got abused so many times. Which Angular 2 is a completely rewritten Angular application. So, yeah. Mm. With great power comes great responsibility. So is there any kind of questions on some of the built-in directives we talked about? There's a lot more that we won't actually be able to cover, but these are some of the main ones that I use every day. Okay, so if there's not any questions, we'll go to the next section. And our next section is actually creating custom directives. And we've kind of already discussed what custom directives are. So I don't think I have any other slides for this. So we're just going to jump back into Plunker and move our current application that we've made into its own custom directive.
So I have a question about the Champions controller.
Mhm.
It was assigned to the body tag, but I'm wondering, can you have multiple controllers on a page? Like if
Yeah.
you have multiple modules?
Uh,
And can that
well,
then...
multiple modules is kind of tricky. I've
Mhm.
actually had to do that before, and I actually had, if you're using, you can use multiple modules on the page, but if you try to use the NG app on with multiple modules, it actually won't work. You can only use one on the current page, but you could use it across your application.
Okay.
So like if you're here, I'm defining it in my index.html, but the way I've done it in the past, I actually had a use case where they wanted multiple applications on the same page. That
Mhm.
way, if they want to move things around, it was in SharePoint, if anybody's familiar with that. They wanted to move these web parts around so that if they want to customize it a little bit without needing a developer, they can just move things into different places. And you have to actually, with Angular, it actually bootstraps the application using ng app for you. But if you want to use multiple modules on the same file or same HTML, you'd have to bootstrap it yourself, and it's a little tricky. And I'd probably have to reference it myself if I wanted to do it again. But you definitely can. In controllers, you definitely can do multiple controllers. I can show you that real quick if you want me to.
Yeah, that was part of my question. Essentially, was does ng controller have to be on the body tag?
No, it can be on any.
Okay.
It can be on any tag.
And ng app, does that have to be on the HTML tag?
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
It can be anywhere.
And then one other question was, is scope scoped to ng app or ng controller, or is it public to?
It's
The whole page?
it's to the controller.
Okay.
We'll get into that after we define our directives, or some example directives. We'll be able to see the different kind of scopes. There's actually multiple different versions of scopes.
Oh, okay.
So we'll get into that a little more later.
Thank you.
Yep. And for the controller question that you had, I'll go ahead and define one real quick, and then we'll get into the custom directives, and you'll see that we really don't use an explicit controller like this very often. We can do that with directives instead, and it gives us more power. And let me just name this foo controller or something. It's not too confusing.
So I have one other question to follow
Okay.
up on that. Is a directive assigned only to a controller, or could it be shared between controllers?
You can share controllers with directives, but it's not best practice.
Okay.
So normally you'd create its own controller, and then that's where kind of scoping comes into play. Is you can share scopes between controllers, and you can pass variables back and forth between the controllers as well. And that's another thing we'll get in a lot more detail when we get to scoping.
Okay.
Let me figure out this real quick. I just want to keep these separate. So if I want to define my ng controller instead of on the body tag, I'm going to define it on this div. And that should work. May have to get back to you on the controller there because I haven't really used them, just ng controller for a while directly. What was that? Oh, it wasn't loading this first one though. When I defined the other one. Oh yeah, you're right. Never mind. Sorry. Yeah, so it was erroring out before it got to the next thing. So now it should work because we are using, what happened there? You go back into here and we'll just use that. Use that variable and it should show up there. And since we're defined that, let's try something else and add another thing here. I want it some different value. And we'll reference that inside of here. Just to see what it does. And I want to comment this out. And that should not be available because we're defining it inside of here. So yeah. Any other questions?
No, that's it.
Okay, cool. No, it can be the same name. It's just I created the variable here, and I just wanted to see if it was going to try to reference the other one. But since they're in separate divs here, it shouldn't matter. So let's do one other test, and I'd expect this to work. Let me get rid of this one here. And that should be, yeah. So the controllers here are sharing the same scope since we're defining them nested like that, which is similar to what we'll talk about with directives. But I don't think for controllers you can define what scope you want to use. You're stuck to using shared scoping. Okay, let me remove that. Let me remove this controller. And this.
That seems like not a good practice, though, to actually, same period.
Yes, definitely, especially if your application starts to grow and you're wondering, where's this variable coming from? And it's actually coming from the parent scope of your controller. It could be really confusing that way. But I promise we'll get to scoping and it'll be less confusing because we'll talk about the different kind of scopes, and then you won't have that problem with, oh, I have a variable up in my parent scope that's the same as the child scope. We can kind of control that with our different kind of scoping we have available. So now I'm going to change this or create a new directive. I'm actually going to get rid of this preview because it's going to take a while to define this. That way it doesn't keep flashing at us. And then I'm going to actually prefix this kind of like Angular does with ng. And then since our module is called do the things, I'm just going to prefix it with DTT. And our directives are a little bit different when you define them. You have to actually return an object. So it'll look kind of funky here, but I'm just going to do like an inline object here. So that's what this kind of syntax is I'm going to return just this empty object for now, and then I'll define some properties in here to tell it to tell Angular what kind of directive it's going to be, and define, actually reuse this controller that we have here, and then move that controller into the actual directive. So the first thing I'm actually going to do is, since usually you tell Angular that you want to restrict it to a certain kind of element or a different kind of tag. So here I'm telling Angular, I'm going to create this new directive, and I'm going to only be able to use this in an element tag. Yeah, sorry. So here I'm restricting it to only using the element kind of syntax, and I'll show when I actually define it in the HTML. It'll be a little more clear, but I'm just going to define this a little bit first, and then put it in the HTML, and it should magically work. Okay, and since we're defining our controller, or telling Angular to use this controller inside of our directive, we no longer actually need to tell Angular to create the controller. So I can delete that, and now Angular is smart enough to say, oh, you're referencing this controller. I'm going to go ahead and create that controller so that you don't have to on the actual module. But this also won't, you won't be able to expose it to the DOM using ng controller. So now if I try to load this again, it's not going to work because I'm not actually defining the controller on my module. So the way I'm going to fix that is, instead of using this controller, I'm going to use my new fancy directive that I made. So you see we're defining the directive here, and we're actually using camel casing here. So our first letter is lowercase, and then our next definition here is, or our next kind of thing is capitalized, and then the app is capitalized. And then inside of our HTML, it's snake casing. That's something that can be kind of confusing, and that's some of the gotcha kind of moments, like, oh, why is my directive not working? Well, I'm not using the right casing. So you have to make sure, if you define your directive in your JavaScript, you always use camel casing, and then to reference that inside of the HTML, you use the snake casing. You can, if I would, but then you have to update this as well. So let me actually define it, and I'll demonstrate that in a minute. So I actually have to tell it a template here. So right now I'm just going to do an inline template here. And I need to get rid of, I'm just going to comment out this code for now. And actually I need to get rid of this variable. So now instead of actually doing all the HTML inside of my index file here, I'm telling it to use this directive. And then I'm defining the directive here with the restrict to an element. That's restricting it so you can only use it in this kind of syntax. If you wanted to use it as an attribute, you would use it here. That would be like the attribute directive if you would change this E to an A. But in our case, we'll be using just the element. And it is very useful to use the attribute directive, but most cases you'll be using the element here. Some use cases I've come into with actually using an attribute directive instead of an element directive is if I have some kind of widget or something that I want to add to other elements on the page. So back to your question about the lowercase. If I make all this lowercase, it's not actually going to know where to split everything. So if you want to use all lowercase, you'd have to go back and change this to not using snake casing anymore. Now it should work again, unless I messed up some kind of syntax error. This needs to be, now it should work again. Let me change that back. Yeah.
Is that legal? I think there was I read something about related to web components that it requires a dash in the element name.
I'm not
so that
sure.
It never
That's a good
conflicts
question.
with like potentially new, like the W3C or whatever. They
It's
decided that they're never going to create a new element with a dash in it.
Oh, okay.
I think.
Yeah,
that
I
works
mean,
for
best
attributes,
practices,
too.
you usually at least prefix it with something, like this DTT that we're doing.
Right.
And then that makes it required to have a dash in it because you're saying DTT, and then you're using whatever the directive name is going to be. So if you see this on a large scale application, you're going to see DTT dash whatever the directive name is all over your application.
Like your namespace, basically.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
And it makes it easy and readable inside of your HTML. And you see DTT dash something. You're like, oh,
Okay.
that's a custom element that we created somewhere.
Okay.
So let's go find maybe the error or whatever is coming from there. We can then jump into code and try to figure out what's going on there. That's another reason why prefixing is really useful, because you can see that that's something I created. So maybe the bug's not coming from this element or whatever. It's something I need to go through and debug.
Okay.
And I'm going to change this back to using snake casing. And instead of using a template, the template tag, there's a few other ones in here, but I'm going to use template URL, and then I'm going to create a new file here in a minute. That way we can reference this later, or reference it in a separate file. That's usually best practices too, is separate your HTML files outside of your JavaScript. Plus, it's really weird to actually define your template inside of your JavaScript, I think, and it can get really long. And since before ES 2015, if you want to use multi-lines, you'd have to do plus and all that kind of stuff for each line that you define. So it's better to separate this into a different file. I forgot to actually say HTML there. And then I'm going to create this thing. And I'm just going to, oh, I forgot to. I don't know why it's telling me it's commented out. Oh, there we go. Okay, so now you can see that it's magically working again. It's just a different way to do it with the controller that we defined earlier. And then given the template URL. And this makes our index file look a lot better. It's separating the component into, or separating the HTML into a directive that we're defining rather than having the index file cluttered with different code. This is also something like we talked about earlier, is using this as a reusable component. So if I want to, I could define another one. Now we should have 2 on there. I could keep doing this. You can use it as many times as you want. Of course, that's.
What would happen if you added somebody?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'm
question.
curious what the scope does. Oh, wow, that's pretty cool.
I got a question. Can Angular read from the CGI scope to basically get an idea of where it's at on the server, so you could have different variables for files, whether it's local or remote or dev server?
It's a good question. I'm not sure about that. I know you can like define your own scopes and stuff like that. If you want to get something at a remote server, you'd probably have to use the HTTP service that we'll get into later. But if you want to create a variable that's kind of across the board, is kind of what you're saying, right? Is you want to use a variable across the application, right? Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I haven't used that kind of, or had that use case before. Yeah, it's sharing the controller, or it's sharing the scope. So when we create something here, it's sharing the same scope. I think that's what our next topic is talking about the different kind of scopes. Let me remove this, all these extra things that we don't need. Sure. Is there any questions on directives at all? Okay, cool. So we only have a half hour left, and I know everyone's really wanting to learn what scope is. But I think we're going to just go over what we've, or kind of do an overview of what we've already went over, and if answer any kind of questions you have, or anything that you think that I have in my agenda slide that you think needs to be covered that I don't have. Let me find my agenda slide here. So far we've talked about what actually Angular is, the decoupling of DOM. We've seen the power of Angular with the two-way binding between the JavaScript and HTML. We've seen kind of the model view controller part of it. Well, not the model part yet, but we've seen the view and controller part. But we'll get into model more when we actually create like the service. We've seen dependency injection. The only thing we've seen so far is $scope, but we'll see some other ones when we get into the $HTTP and any other kind of things you might have questions about. Also talked about how to set up and Plunker. Talked about our controllers and how to define those using NGController. Went into a little more detail when we defined more controllers on the page than just one. Then we moved that over to, then we talked about like ngRepeat and other Angular type directives and filters and why you shouldn't actually use a filter, even though they're nice and powerful. I know. I wanted to show you how awesome it is, and then rip it away from you. So Matt actually had a question about that too. Is if we can't search like that, how should we do it? I think a better approach would be to use like an input field like we had, but then have like a submit button, and then actually do the search manually inside of your JavaScript and update the DOM that way. The reason being is because once you start scaling your application and adding a lot of things, there ends up becoming a lot of watchers and stuff going on. Because the way Angular knows when to update the DOM is it's using a watch. And that can be very expensive if you have lots of them on the screen. It does. Yeah. So the application, there's actually a Chrome extension you can install. There's actually two of them. They're called Batarang. It's confusing that there's two, but both of them are kind of useful. One will actually tell you how many watchers are going on the screen or on the current page. And I think my application that I'm working on is a very large application, and I have over 10,000 watchers going on. So that's why something like the filter is bad to use, because you got to try to reduce the number of watchers that are going on. There's I'm not sure if there's any kind of tools like that, but I know there's different kind of performance tests you can run just overall kind of thing. But I'm not sure if there's some Angular specific. The only one I've played around with is like the Batarang plugin to be able to see like the watchers that are going on. That's also useful for scoping. You can see like the different kind of scopes. That's actually the other one. There's two of them. One has an icon and one doesn't, which is kind of weird. So let me actually bring that open and see. So actually, I think I go into our plunker, inspect this guy. I have my fancy AngularJS thing here. And this is the other one. This doesn't tell you the amount of watchers. But if we go inside of the Chrome store, if I remember how to get to it, usually it shows up like as an app there. Okay, there we go. Okay, I'm just going to do the Google search. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just shows up there. But if you want to cover that in more detail, I can definitely. I haven't really used it too much, but I can show some examples of how to use it. How do you spell it? Range? No, that's not how you spell it. Yeah. Okay, see, there's two of them. One with an icon, one that doesn't have an icon. I think this one actually tells you how many watchers are going on, and then this one is the one that I had open earlier, which tells you like scoping stuff. So let's see what we have here. Get out of full screen. Refresh this and save this. I think they conflict with each other, so you might have to disable one and then enable the other one. But let's just see how many we have going on with our simple application here. So I think I want to disable this one and then refresh the page. And then I think they even, do they look the same? Yeah, I think they do. I haven't really used it that often. One of our coworkers did a presentation on Angular performance, and he's used this a lot more than I have. But yeah, I could look into that. Let me see. Talk about the other things we've talked about our built-in components like the bad filtering and the ng repeat, ngIf, and ng model, and then we haven't really used the service outside of scope yet, but we'll get into that when we create our own custom service and when we use the $HTTP service to get some remote data. And we've talked about the filter and why you shouldn't use them. So I think going off of that too is the reason why not to use them is because every keystroke, it has to it goes through all of that full array, see if it needs to update, and then you do another keystroke, and then it keeps doing the same thing. So if you ever do use it, I think you can limit it, the calls to it. I forget how to, but I know you can, because I haven't used the filter for a while, but I know you can maybe wait until it's a certain length and then actually do the search.
I have a question related to that. So I have dealt with this sort of problem before and used something called throttling on requests. And it kind of leads to my bigger question, which is, in general, it looks like if you make a change to the DOM or make a change to the model, it seems to instantly re-render.
Yeah.
And is there a way to control rendering, or do we just trust Angular to handle rendering performantly?
That's a good question. I think just changing things that way, or maybe using a different Angular directive, will help out a lot more than just. I don't think you can control the actual rendering going on behind the scenes with Angular unless you use a specific Angular directive. and then you update things either in your JavaScript in a more performant way, or try to reduce like the number of watchers by using a different Angular directive. I haven't used that. What is it? Yeah. Cool. I haven't used it before. I'll have to take a look at it sometime. Okay, and then we just created our own custom directive using the .directive syntax, and we talked about kind of the gotchas with the camel casing and snake casing, which is kind of a weird thing you have to do, but they actually fixed that in Angular 2, which we won't get into, but you just define it differently in Angular 2 with actual snake casing instead of the camel casing and weird confusion between the two. I think that's pretty much what we talked about. Is there any questions or anything that you see in the agenda that you want to cover that it is not in there?
I have a really general question about Angular. Is there like an Angular store or something where you go to just kind of compiles all the plugins or something that you might want to use? So like that UI tool you talked about, I typically will do that with jQuery. Like I'll search for like jQuery tools or something that do the sorting and searching and that sort of thing. But I was thinking Angular might have specific plugins.
They do.
Where would you? Do you just Google? For
I
them
just
or-
Google like
Oh, got it.
even though I don't really like Angular UI Bootstrap, but this is one that can be used easily. You just define it in your script tag or whatever it requires, and then you inside of the model definition or module definition, you have to actually put in here UI.bootstrap. And then Angular will now know about that new module or new plugin that you have available, and then you can start using their own directives. So like, for example, if you use this one, it'll tell you here exactly what I said. It was like the UI Bootstrap kind of thing. And then you can just start using it, and you find a good example here. Okay, there's an example. This is just the Bootstrap accordion. So if you click on one of these guys, it'll just pop open this kind of thing, and then you can use it in different ways. So find that. Okay, so here they're using an element Angular directive, and then you can just start using it as soon as you define it inside of your module. There's a lot there, to use separate directives. It really depends. It depends on what the use case is. If you can bring it to whatever client you're working on and say, hey, it'd be really useful if I could use this. I think it just depends on the client. I think in our application that I'm working on currently, we are using UI Bootstrap, and it was probably added a while ago, but it was an easy thing to kind of get in there. That's a good question. That's kind of something you can set up on your environment. If you're familiar, are you familiar with Node or Bower? And there's a couple of things you can do there. We use Bower on our project, so. Oh, okay. So, I don't think I have any Yeah. Sometimes they could be separate and not on Bower or Node. Yeah. Yeah, that's what a lot of people are doing now because it's another overhead you don't really need, and you could just do it through npm, and then unfortunately then you have to reference the node modules, and that's kind of what Bower does anyways, right? So inside of, let me try to find an example. Here we go. Yeah, and if you want to be on a specific version, you can actually tell. I'll find you an example. Right now, I'm kind of struggling trying to find an example, but inside of your Bower.json, it's just like a JSON object, and then you can tell it a specific version, and you can tell it to always upgrade to the latest version, or you can, yeah, that's a bad idea. You should always stick to a version. And with like Node and other tasks, like, so there's typically use something like Node or Gulp. Gulp is kind of how you a task manager kind of, if you've done any kind of like backend development or use any kind of compiled language, they usually have task runners too. Like Maven would be an example, Gradle, or Make is a typical like C version. But you can create your own tasks, and if you want to get it ready for like a production environment, you can just do like a gulp prod, and you can define that task, and it'll do something different, and it'll install the right things that you need based on either your Node package manager or your Bower package manager.
I have another general question about Angular.
Okay.
So a while back, when they announced that they were going to be building Angular 2, I kind of just like figured I'd forget about Angular until 2 was out. But then 2 was out, and nobody really liked it.
Mhm.
And now we're learning 1, even though 2 is now out. And I'm wondering, are there still people like supporting and working on Angular 1? And
Yes, definitely.
what's going on there?
I think it'll be a while before people move to Angular 2 because it's such a huge upgrade. It's such an overhead to actually upgrade to it. Even though Angular has documented it very well, to upgrade to Angular 2, I think it's going to be a while before people actually upgrade completely. And I think it's on release candidate 4 right now, so it's not completely out yet. But I know I've played around with it a little bit, and I actually like it, but a lot of people would rather stick with JavaScript. I think the main things that I've seen against it was using TypeScript. But on the other side, the reason people like it too is because of TypeScript. So I think TypeScript is the biggest thing that people dislike or like about the new Angular. But I think both are very useful. They have similar concepts. So like directives is still a thing in Angular 2. They're just they're defined differently. And you're using classes with TypeScript instead of using scope and all that kind of thing. So yeah, you're using TypeScript instead. That's kind of the way you scope things. Yeah, I haven't gotten into Angular 2 too much yet, but that's something definitely I want to get into, and I think knowing both is very useful. But I think learning Angular 1 is a good thing because there's going to be so many apps out there that currently use Angular 1, and it yep. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you're going to work on a brand new project that's not using Angular 1, I think it'd be a good thing to kind of look into Angular 2 as well, or just learn both and see which one you like better, and just stick with whatever one. So some of the concepts will transfer, but like I said, it's just different syntax using TypeScript and stuff. if we get to it, I could, since you had the question about setting up your local environment and stuff like that, if we can get to it, I might be able to talk about that. If that's something you would want to learn about. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's why I kind of kept it in Plunker, because getting into Gulp and NPM and all the other kind of build tools can be kind of complicated. And I wanted to keep this more Angular focused. But if that's something you want to learn, or something you're interested in, or we could, there's other Angular topics that I think is useful, like that I don't have on here, because Angular is such a broad topic. There's a lot more things we could talk about. We could talk about best practices. We could talk about DOM manipulation using a link function, which is kind of what Angular recommends to use if you do any kind of DOM manipulation on the page, which there's multiple use cases for that. It just depends on what you guys want to get out of it. I can put a couple more things on here, and if we get to it, we get to it. If we don't, we don't.
What are you most excited?
I haven't really contributed to it yet. I think it'd be something cool that I could do in the future, apart from learning other languages, of course, too. Because I'm always trying to learn something new, right? So right now I'm more focused on seeing what else is out there, learning Angular 2. But I think contributing to any kind of open source thing is something that I would love to do at some point. Feel free to email me if you see something we missed here in the agenda, and or if you have any other overall questions.